The streets of Harlem were never the same after Bumpy Johnson. It was 1968, a year of unrest, but the air in Harlem was thick with change, not only because of the civil rights movement or the violent echoes of protest, but because Harlem, the heartbeat of Black America, was still being shaped by a legend. The day began like any other, with the hum of the city's energy, the pulse of jazz escaping from bar doors, and the rhythmic step of people trying to survive the only way they knew how. But as the sun set that day, the memory of Bumpy Johnson would once again come to the forefront, cementing his legacy in a place he'd never truly left. The clash had been building for months. The new wave of street hustlers had risen, taking cues from the old-school gangsters, but with their own modern twist. The shifting power dynamics in Harlem were palpable, and with them came the undeniable question: how long could the streets stay loyal to a man who had been a force of nature in the city? A man who had held the balance of power for so long, yet whose shadow had become a specter after his time. As word spread that Bumpy Johnson's legacy was on the line, the tension built to a fever pitch. It wasn't just about the men who ran the streets now. No, it was about respect. The kind that Bumpy had earned through decades of keeping the fragile balance in Harlem intact. And there was no one better to challenge that than a new crop of men who thought they could take the reins. But Harlem knew better. Harlem had seen what happened when Bumpy Johnson held the streets in his hands. The confrontation wasn't physical. It didn't need to be. It happened in the back rooms, in the quiet whispers shared between those who still remembered the man and those who feared his influence. No one ever forgot Bumpy, not really. His power had been built on more than just money and fear. It had been built on loyalty, on respect, on community. But this was a time of change. Harlem was in the midst of its own revolution, social, cultural, and political. The streets buzzed with new ideas, new leadership. Yet Bumpy's name remained, etched into the very fabric of the city. It wasn't just his criminal empire that defined him, but his ability to steer Harlem through the chaos of the early 20th century. It was his unspoken rule that earned him respect from even those who hated him the most. The moment of reckoning came in a small, dimly lit bar just off 125th Street. The old-timers sat at the bar, nursing drinks, exchanging stories. They were waiting, watching, for someone to speak up, for someone to call the shots. Bumpy had passed a few years ago, but his influence was still being felt. One of the younger men, eager to step into his shoes, leaned over the counter, tapping a cigarette into his palm. "Think Harlem will ever forget him?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the murmur of the bar. One of the older men, his face weathered by time, looked at the younger man with a steady gaze. "Forget him? Son, Bumpy's shadow will hang over these streets long after we're gone." His voice was gravelly, but there was an unmistakable reverence in it. Harlem doesn't forget men like him, and it sure as hell doesn't forgive those who tried to take what he built. The younger man scoffed, lighting his cigarette with a flick of his hand. But what if the world has moved on? The old ways aren't the same anymore. Men like Bumpy don't fit here anymore. The old man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You don't understand, do you? Bumpy didn't just own the streets, he owned the people. The real power wasn't in the corners or the deals. It was in the hearts of those who lived here. You think you can just take that, step into his shoes? You'd better be ready for more than just a fight. You'd better be ready for a war." The younger man fell silent. He knew the stakes now. It wasn't about gang wars or territory. It was about the respect that Bumpy had earned, the way he had turned Harlem into something that no one could just take from under its people. And yet, as the years passed, the myth of Bumpy Johnson was becoming something more than just the story of one man. It was becoming the very essence of Harlem itself. And in 1968, Harlem was a place on the brink of change, a place where the old and new collided. The question wasn't just whether Harlem could move on without Bumpy, but whether the new generation of hustlers, politicians, and activists could uphold the legacy of respect, loyalty, and unity that he had forged. Bumpy's death had left a vacuum, but the city was a living, breathing entity. and it would always be a place where power, respect, and survival intersected in ways no one could predict. As the man who had been part of shaping Harlem's destiny, Bumpy's influence was alive in the blood of the city, running deep even in 1968. Bumpy Johnson's name was synonymous with Harlem. He was the man who had shaped the streets, the neighborhoods, and the very essence of the city itself. His rise from humble beginnings in South Carolina to becoming one of the most powerful figures in Harlem's history wasn't just a tale of a gangster. It was the story of a man who understood the world around him, who built his empire not on fear alone, but on a foundation of loyalty and respect. In the early 20th century, Harlem was the epicenter of black culture in America. Jazz clubs, speakeasies, and the energy of the Harlem Renaissance filled the streets. But beneath the surface of this cultural awakening, there was another, darker side, an underworld of organized crime where men like Bumpy Johnson rose to power. Bumpy was no stranger to the struggle, no stranger to fighting for his place in a world that had long denied black men the same opportunities as their white counterparts. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a battleground. The fight for power in the streets of Harlem wasn't just about territory, it was about influence. And in a city where life and death were often determined by the strength of your alliances, Bumpy Johnson was a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a man who understood the true power of the streets. He knew the importance of having the right people behind you, of maintaining control over the areas that mattered, and of ensuring that loyalty was always more important than money. At his peak, Bumpy's influence stretched far beyond the city limits. He had connections with politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement, all of whom knew that crossing him could be as dangerous as stepping into the path of a freight train. But what truly set Bumpy apart was his ability to navigate the complex political landscape of Harlem. He didn't just rely on brute force. He used his mind, his strategic thinking, and his understanding of human nature to stay ahead of his rivals. Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s was a different world. It was a place where the rules of the game were always shifting, where alliances were forged and broken on a daily basis. Bumpy was a product of that world, a man who knew that survival in Harlem wasn't just about making money, but about making the right moves at the right time. He had a knack for knowing when to strike and when to wait. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead. By the time the 1960s arrived, Harlem had changed. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and the streets were filled with a new generation of young activists fighting for equality. But Harlem had always been a place where change happened on its own terms. The old guard, including men like Bumpy Johnson, still held sway. They may have been pushed out of the limelight by the new generation of political leaders and social movements, but their influence never truly disappeared. The world that Bumpy had built was slowly crumbling. The illegal liquor trade that had once fueled his empire was drying up, and the days of easy money were behind him. But Bumpy wasn't the kind of man to retreat into the shadows. Even in the face of the shifting tides, he remained a powerful figure. The streets still remembered him, and his legacy was still intact. The new generation of hustlers who walked the streets of Harlem in 1968 knew that they had to navigate a world shaped by the actions of men like Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson's power was not just about control, it was about understanding the people around him. He had been a protector of Harlem, not through brute force, but through a sense of responsibility to the community. His power was built on the loyalty of those who worked for him, who saw him not as a gangster but as a figure who fought for them, who understood their struggles and fought to protect them. He wasn't a king in the traditional sense. He was a man who had earned the streets' respect, and that respect was something that could never be taken away, no matter how much time passed. The men who came after him tried to emulate his methods, but none could match his ability to hold the balance of power in Harlem. The streets were filled with men who had learned from Bumpy, but they had missed the point. Bumpy's legacy was not in the methods he used to maintain control. It was in the respect he commanded, the sense of justice he instilled in the community, and the way he kept the delicate equilibrium of Harlem intact. In 1968, the world had changed, and Harlem was no longer the same place it had been in Bumpy's heyday. The new generation of activists, politicians, and hustlers were fighting their own battles, but they still looked back to Bumpy as a figure who had been a guiding force in Harlem's history. His influence could still be felt in the way the community responded to authority, in the way they stood up for what they believed was right. Bumpy may have been gone, but his legacy was still very much alive in the hearts and minds of the people who had known him. He had left a mark on Harlem that would never fade, a mark that was woven into the very fabric of the neighborhood. The story of Bumpy Johnson was far from over. It was a legend that had been passed down, generation by generation, a story that continued to shape the streets, the people, and the very soul of Harlem itself. By 1968, Harlem was at a crossroads. The Cultural Revolution was taking place with the rise of the Black Power movement, and young leaders were emerging to fight for social justice, racial equality, and the dismantling of systemic oppression. The streets were no longer dominated by the traditional criminals, but by a new wave of activists and thinkers who sought to reshape the very fabric of Harlem's identity. It was a time of social upheaval, and with it came a new challenge to the legacy of Bumpy Johnson. A challenge not from the law or rival gangsters, but from the very heart of Harlem's shifting politics. In the wake of Bumpy's death, a power vacuum had formed in the underworld. The men who had followed Bumpy weren't just looking for survival, they wanted control of the streets, the power that Bumpy had held for so long, but there was no one quite like him to step into those shoes. The younger generation didn't understand the game the way Bumpy had. They weren't interested in the kind of respect that Bumpy had earned. They were driven by greed, by ambition, by a hunger for control. It was in this environment that Leroy Big Mac Matthews, a rising figure in Harlem's criminal circles, began to make a name for himself. Big Mac wasn't like the other men who had followed Bumpy's footsteps. He had no loyalty to the community, no understanding of Harlem's intricate social contract. He saw the streets as a business, a commodity to be sold and controlled. His methods were harsh, his tactics brutal. But what he lacked in honor, he made up for in ruthlessness. Big Mac's challenge to Bumpy's legacy wasn't just about seizing power, it was about rewriting the rules of the game entirely. He had learned from Bumpy's era, but he twisted those lessons to fit his own vision. He knew the key to controlling Harlem was to break the bonds of loyalty that had once kept the streets in check. He started recruiting younger men, those who were disillusioned with the old ways, eager for a new kind of leadership. They saw him as a fresh face, a symbol of the future, free from the old traditions that had governed Harlem for so long. But in the midst of all the new faces, there was still the old guard, those who remembered what Harlem had been under Bumpy's reign. They remembered the code of respect, the sense of community, the balance that Bumpy had maintained. The old-timers were still there, watching the streets, feeling the tension between the new and the old. As Big Mac's power began to grow, so did the divide between the old and the new. It was clear that a clash was inevitable. The younger men who followed Big Mac were hungry for power, but the old men who had been around when Bumpy ruled knew that power wasn't something you took. It was something you earned. And the streets, the people of Harlem, weren't going to let just anyone walk in and take what had been so carefully built. Big Mac's rise was fast, but it wasn't without resistance. There were whispers of rebellion in the air. Some of the old-timers, men who had once been Bumpy's trusted allies, began to gather their forces, ready to fight for what they saw as their rightful claim to Harlem's throne. These were men who had seen the city change, seen empires rise and fall, and they weren't about to let a newcomer like Big Mac undermine everything they had fought for. The tipping point came one fateful evening when Big Mac's men made a bold move, trying to muscle in on a long-established territory that had once been under Bumpy's protection. It was a gamble, a test of strength. They thought they could intimidate the community, force them to submit to their new rule. But they hadn't counted on one thing, the spirit of Harlem. The spirit that Bumpy had instilled, a spirit of resilience, of pride, of defiance. They had underestimated the bond between the streets and the people who had always called it home. Big Mac's move sparked outrage among the old-timers, but it also galvanized a younger generation of men who still remembered the power that Bumpy had wielded. These men didn't just follow Bumpy for the money, they followed him for the respect, for the sense of belonging, for the pride of being part of something greater than themselves. They knew that Big Mac, for all his strength and ambition, couldn't hold a candle to what Bumpy had built. They were ready to fight for that legacy. The community began to stir. Whispers spread through the alleys, the back rooms, the clubs. Old alliances were rekindled, and new ones were forged. The battle for Harlem had begun in earnest. But this wasn't just about a fight for control. It was about something much deeper. It was about the soul of Harlem, about the values that Bumpy Johnson had instilled in the streets. The air crackled with tension. On one side, you had Big Mac, a man with ambition, with power, but no understanding of what truly made Harlem tick. On the other side, you had the remnants of Bumpy's old world, men who understood that in Harlem, respect was earned, not taken. The streets had seen battles before, but this one felt different. It was as if the very city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which side would come out on top. The final showdown was coming, and when it came, it wouldn't just be a fight for control of the streets. It would be a battle for the very legacy of Bumpy Johnson. The night of the showdown had arrived. The streets of Harlem were on edge, the air thick with anticipation. Word had spread fast, like wildfire through the neighborhood. Big Mac's men had made their move, trying to establish dominance over a territory that had once been Bumpy's. Now the stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of Harlem's streets. Big Mac had been bold in his attempt to take control, and that boldness had brought him face to face with the men who had lived through the old battles, the men who had seen what happened when you challenged the very spirit of Harlem. Among them were the remnants of Bumpy's old crew, loyal men who hadn't forgotten the lessons Bumpy had taught them. They weren't going to let some upstart come in and rewrite the rules of the game. Not in their city. It all came to a head in the heart of Harlem, outside one of the old bars where Bumpy had once held court. The bar had seen countless meetings, deals, and confrontations, but tonight, it was the stage for something far more significant. On one side stood Big Mac and his men, confident in their numbers, but unaware of the storm they had just walked into. On the other side, the old guard, men like Louie, who had served as Bumpy's second-in-command, and others who had been around when Harlem was ruled by Bumpy's code, stood with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Big Mac stepped forward, his eyes scanning the group of men before him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his confidence exuding from every pore. "This is my street now," he declared, his voice firm, cutting through the tension that hung heavy in the air. "I've taken what's mine, and there's no going back. If you think I'm just going to walk away, you're mistaken." Louis, standing at the front of the old guard, stepped forward. He was an older man now, his face weathered by time, but his eyes still burned with the fire of someone who had seen it all. He looked Big Mac up and down, his gaze unwavering. "You think this is about territory?" Louis's voice was calm, but laced with an undeniable authority. "This is about respect. Something you don't understand. You didn't earn these streets. You came in here like a bull in a china shop, and now you're going to learn what happens when you disrespect what Bumpy built." Big Mac sneered, his fists tightening at his sides. "I don't need to earn anything from you, old man. This is the way things are now. This is my time." Louis shook his head, a faint, almost sad smile crossing his face. "You don't get it. Harlem doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to the people, and they'll never follow someone who doesn't understand that." Bumpy didn't rule with fear. He ruled with loyalty. A tense silence hung in the air. The streets seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the first move to be made. But it wasn't Big Mac who made it. It was Louis, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate pace, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You may have power, Big Mac, but you don't have heart, and that's what makes you weak." Big Mac's eyes narrowed. He had spent his entire life building his empire through fear and intimidation. And now this old man was challenging everything he had worked for. Without a word, he lunged forward, throwing a heavy punch in Lewis's direction. But Lewis was faster. In a fluid motion, he sidestepped the blow, grabbing Big Mac's arm and using his own momentum to throw him to the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the air. The men on both sides tensed, their hands hovering over their weapons, waiting for the first real exchange to begin. Big Mac, stunned but furious, scrambled to his feet. "You think this is over?" he growled, his face twisted in anger. Lewis didn't respond. Instead, he gestured to the men behind him, who moved forward with practiced ease, surrounding Big Mac's crew. It wasn't a fight for control of territory, it was a fight for respect. It was a message that Bumpy Johnson's legacy was not something that could be easily taken or destroyed. The air was electric, filled with the sounds of fists meeting flesh, of the harsh breaths of men struggling for dominance. But through the chaos, one thing was clear. The streets were not just a battlefield, they were a symbol. Harlem was more than just a place. It was a community, a family, and no one could ever take that from them. Big Mac fought with everything he had, but the old guard fought with something more. It wasn't just experience, it was honor, loyalty, and a deep connection to the soul of Harlem itself. As the fight raged on, Big Mac's crew began to falter. One by one, they were taken down, not just physically, but mentally. They realized that they weren't fighting for something real. They were fighting for power, but they had no idea what true power meant in Harlem. Big Mac, now outnumbered and exhausted, stood at the center of the chaos, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his footing. "This isn't over," he shouted, but the words rang hollow in the night air. The streets had spoken, and his time had passed. Louis stepped forward, his face grim, but his eyes filled with a sense of quiet victory. "It's over, Big Mac. You lost." With that, the last of Big Mac's men surrendered, and the fight came to a sudden, uneasy halt. The battle for Harlem wasn't just one with fists. It was one with respect. And Harlem had made it clear who it stood behind. The immediate aftermath of the fight was a mixture of exhaustion and quiet reflection. Harlem had been shaken, but its core had remained intact. The old guard stood victorious, but it wasn't just a victory over Big Mac. It was a victory for the very legacy that Bumpy Johnson had left behind. The streets once again were theirs, but this time, they understood something that Big Mac never had. Power without respect was empty, and respect was something that had to be earned, not stolen. Bumpy Johnson's name still echoed through the streets, not as a ghost, but as a living testament to the values that had shaped Harlem's soul. The community responded with gratitude, not just for the victory, but for the reminder that Harlem wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place to thrive. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson had been defended, not just by force, but by the heart of the city itself. The victory on those streets reverberated far beyond the physical confrontation. Big Mac's defeat wasn't just about a man losing his claim to power. It was about something much deeper, the enduring power of Bumpy Johnson's legacy. In the days and weeks that followed, Harlem began to settle into a renewed sense of identity. The old guard, those who had stood by Bumpy, had reminded the younger generation of what it meant to carry his torch. Harlem wasn't just about hustling for the next dollar. It was about building something that could withstand the test of time. In the aftermath, the old-timers who had followed Bumpy, men like Lewis, became living embodiments of that history. They weren't just survivors. They were the stewards of the streets, the ones who carried Bumpy's lessons forward into a new era. Bumpy had been the kind of man who could read people, who could understand the pulse of Harlem, and the men who had served under him carried those lessons with them. In a world that seemed to shift with every passing moment, they were the anchors. They knew that the streets were as much about community as they were about control. But it wasn't just the old men who recognized this. The younger generation, though eager for their own piece of the pie, couldn't ignore the impact Bumpy had made. Even those who had been on the opposite side of the fight began to understand something they hadn't before. Big Mac's ambition had been untempered by the need for respect, and it was that gap that had led to his downfall. It was a harsh lesson in the value of loyalty, honor, and community, the very foundation of the empire Bumpy had built. In the years that followed, Bumpy's legacy would continue to define the streets of Harlem. The city's cultural renaissance might have been rising on the wings of the Black Power movement and the young voices calling for revolution. But Bumpy's influence could still be seen in the way men moved through the streets. Calm, calculated, and with a sense of unspoken authority. The old ways, the code Bumpy had lived by, were not so easily cast aside. Harlem still remembered, and Harlem still respected. The legendary status of Bumpy Johnson didn't rest on the criminal empire he built. It rested on the way he had held the community together. In an era when many were trying to tear down the structures of power and authority, Bumpy had found a way to survive and thrive without betraying the core values of respect, loyalty, and fairness. He had been a king in a kingdom built not of gold, but of people, and that kingdom still stood firm in the hearts of those who had known him. In Harlem, the stories of Bumpy Johnson were passed down from generation to generation. They weren't just tales of a gangster who ran the streets. They were stories of a man who had shaped a community, a place where power wasn't just about what you could take, but about what you could give. The younger men who rose after him knew that they could never match his power, but they could try to emulate the kind of leader he had been. And so Harlem continued to breathe, pulsing with the energy of change and revolution, but always with one foot in the past. Bumpy's legacy, alive in the hearts of the people, was the bridge that connected the old world with the new. The streets might have changed, but the respect that Bumpy had earned remained as strong as ever. Harlem knew that as long as it remembered Bumpy, it could never truly lose its soul. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson was as much about the man's strength as it was about his understanding of people. He didn't just build a criminal empire, he built a community. He didn't just fight battles, he fought for something deeper. The streets knew that the power Bumpy wielded was more than just about dominance. It was about ensuring that no matter what, Harlem would always have its own. Bumpy Johnson's story was one of rise, power, and eventual reflection. A man who, in the end, defined an era. His life was marked by violence and triumph, but also by a sense of responsibility to his community. The legend of Bumpy Johnson isn't just about a gangster. It's about a man who understood that true power wasn't just in controlling the streets. It was in commanding respect from the very people who lived on those streets. As the streets of Harlem carried on into the 1960s and beyond, one truth remained clear. Bumpy's impact was unshakable. He had built something that wasn't just about survival, but about purpose. His lessons echoed through the generations, carried by those who remembered what it meant to fight not just for territory, but for honor. Harlem would continue to change, evolve, and rise. But it would never forget the lessons of Bumpy Johnson, because sometimes it takes a legend to show the world that the fight for respect, for justice, and for community isn't just a battle for power, it's a battle for legacy. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's story wasn't just about a man, it was about the soul of Harlem itself, a soul that would forever bear his mark.